I don't know their names. I've never seen a portrait of any of them. I've never seen anything written by any of them. Even their description in the title I've given you is pretty inaccurate. Okay, even Regency Britain, I suppose, I'm using very loosely. What I mean is the early part of the 19th century, before Victorian times. If you remember, Victorians quite uptight, Regency a bit more raffish. But Chinese language teachers, that's the closest I can come to describing who these people are in today's terminology, but the terminology I found in my sources is slightly different. They're all called, or most frequently called, moonshis. What's a moonshi? It's spelt variously. It's actually an Arabic word. It means, and it's used in South Asia more than in East Asia, it means an Asian language secretary, somebody who will do your correspondence in an Indian language or whatever you need. Occasionally I've seen these people also called pundits. I mean, a pundit is a man on the telly who thinks he knows about football, but the original meaning of pundit means scholar. Now, why are these people important? Well, if you look at the history of British traders in China, already by the end of the 17th century, there are some who could speak Chinese. Beginning of the 18th century, there's clearly at least one who is trying to master reading Chinese. But the one thing that was always extraordinarily difficult was to be able to write Chinese. Because what was written in Chinese, especially if it was official correspondence, but really just about anything, unless it was a popular novel, and one or two other genres like that, had to be written not in Chinese, except in Chinese. What I mean is it was in classical Chinese, which is a language which uses, as you may be aware, the same writing system, much of the same vocabulary, but really different grammar, a lot of allusions and set phrases and so forth. Extraordinarily difficult for anybody who's not brought up within Chinese culture at that time. I mean, it's difficult, I think, today, because it's not part of the culture for anybody, but certainly if you were brought up Chinese at that time and you were in an educated family, you could deal with it, the allusions and so forth. But Britons, no. But they really needed people to help them with this, because otherwise they couldn't communicate with the Chinese authorities except through you know, the kind of business English, the so-called pidgin English, that was popular in Canton in the 18th century. And that really didn't help when you were trying to send a message not to the people in charge in Canton, but say to the emperor. So in 1759 there was an Englishman who did know, spoken Chinese reasonably well, and the merchants wanted to send a letter to the emperor, a memorial technically. So he found a friend who could do this into proper Chinese, and off he went, sailing north towards Beijing to deliver his letter to the emperor. He didn't get very far. He got to North China when the authorities picked him up, found the letter. He said, yeah, it was a Chinese friend who did this. They sent it to the emperor to have a look at it. The emperor said, this wasn't written by a foreigner, was it? And sent the English guy off to Macau to be in jail for 3 years, so having the, you know, trying to circumvent the regular channels. Found the guy who had actually written the thing and executed him. Not, I think, because he had tried teaching a foreigner Chinese. I don't think that was the issue. I think it was collaborating with a foreign power, really. He was seen as a traitor, but it kind of put a damper on the whole teaching of Chinese to foreigners in Canton. So it left all foreigners, but the Brits especially, since they were trying to make headway in relations with China. But the real problem, when the McCartney mission set out in 1792, the best they could do was look around Europe for anybody who knew Chinese, and they found a couple of Chinese Catholic priests in Naples, so they hired them. Of course, they didn't speak English, but everybody could at least write Latin in those days if they were well educated. Again, you know, I don't think Britons at that time were surprised that you had to write another language, because they were having to write Latin a lot to communicate internationally. and the page boy on the embassy did actually learn, the future Sir George Staunton did learn to read and write a little bit of Chinese from these characters. But it wasn't an ideal solution. And when the first British missionary arrived in Canton in 1807, he had a real hard time acquiring a knowledge of written Chinese, because he wanted to translate the Bible into Chinese. How's he going to do that? Especially translate it into a style that people will find readable. His name was Robert Morrison. He had run into a Chinese visitor to London, curiously, even before he left, but that Chinese visitor stayed in London, and Morrison arrived and just had to find whoever he could who was prepared to teach him Chinese secretly. Quite frequently these people are, if not Catholic priests, then at least have a Catholic education including Latin, so that that tends to be the common tongue. But it was clearly an effort for him as well. Now, obviously, after the execution of this first Chinese helper, everybody kept a low profile, but where you do see a little bit more discussion of who these people were is when they're outside Chinese territory. Now, for example, in Bengal, in about 1805, a language college had been set up by the Duke of Wellington's brother, actually, who was governor of India earlier on, and this place called Fort William College, Calcutta, had a redoubtable Scotsman on the staff called the Reverend Claudius Buchanan. And Claudius Buchanan found there was actually somebody from Macau who'd ended up bankrupt in Calcutta. He'd come there to trade, and he had brought his Chinese teacher with him. He wasn't Portuguese, as you'd expect from Macau. He was an Armenian. Lots of Armenians trading throughout East Asia and South Asia from the Middle Ages, we know. So this gentleman, Johannes Lassar, was immediately signed up and said, you're a professor of Chinese in Fort William College, and your friend is going to be the moonshi, because they were hiring a lot of moonshis, these sort of local language experts in this college at the time. Well, Johannes Lassar knew Armenian, Portuguese and Chinese. He didn't know English, so this venture didn't persist for very long before the college ran out of funds anyhow. But Claudius Buchanan then said, oh well, okay, I've got some more work you can do. You can translate the Bible from Armenian into Chinese, and I have some friends who will help you. Not in Calcutta, but about 10 miles up the river at a small Danish trading post called Serampore. The Brits didn't like missionaries because they were always trouble, but the Danes were more sympathetic. So some British Baptist missionaries, including William Carey and somebody called Joshua Marshman, had used Serampore, this little Danish trading post, as a kind of base. And here the Armenian and his Chinese friend end up, and they start translating the Bible. Again, Joshua Marshman is a very learned man. He knows, Latin, Greek, Hebrew, French, by this stage Bengali and several other Indian languages, but unfortunately he doesn't know Armenian, he doesn't know Portuguese, and he wants to learn Chinese, but under the circumstances it must have been tough. And no wonder that the Bible they eventually produced is a little bit odd. Never mind. What should happen by about 1811, but a real English gentleman shows up in Calcutta. He's brought his language teacher with him too, his moonshi. This is somebody called Thomas Manning, extraordinary person, who seems to be the only person, certainly in the early 19th century, possibly in the whole 19th century, who wanted to learn Chinese because he wanted to know what China was all about. He didn't want to sell opium or promote British diplomacy or convert them to Christianity. He just wanted to know what it was all about. So he got out to Canton, having got some quick medical qualifications, hoping to sell himself as a doctor to the Chinese court. The Chinese court said, we got doctors. So he thought, and he then thought, I'll sneak into China through the back door. So he went to Vietnam, thinking to sneak into China that way. They found out what he was up to and stopped him. The reason why he's in Calcutta with his friend is that he's thinking of going in through Assam or somewhere like that. But that doesn't work out. So, and the government of India is not very interested in his plans anyhow. So in the end, he just sets off by himself through Bhutan into Tibet. Him and his Chinese friend. When I say Chinese friend, of course, this again is somebody with a Catholic education, and they're chatting in Latin all the way into Tibet. It is surreal. They actually meet the Dalai Lama together. This is a little-known incarnation of the Dalai Lama, number 9. He was only a child, you know, not one of the big-time ones that you see visiting these days. But Thomas Manning was the first Englishman to meet the Dalai Lama, and he has a wonderful journal of his trip into Tibet. People have said, it doesn't say much about Tibet, does it? True, because I think it wasn't intended to. I think he had another journal which told you, you know, what Tibet is like and how to get there. But unfortunately, he sent it to Joshua Marshman, who he was pals with from back in Calcutta. Now, Joshua Marshman's son points out that my father was very learned, very pious. He was a wonderful man, but he had one failing. If you lent him a book or a manuscript, you'd never see it again. He'd drop it or you know, spoil it or forget he had it and never return it. And I think that's what happened to Manning's account of Tibet. So what we have instead is the account he wrote, I think, for his relatives, because it simply tells you how he felt about going into Tibet with a Latin-speaking Chinese. And of course, Manning was from Norfolk, which is quite flat. He's in the Himalayas. The Moonshi, his friend, is from Canton or somewhere, and is also totally unfamiliar with Tibet. And the place clearly gets them down. And Manning gets more and more irritable, and the Moonshi gets more and more sulky. So they irritate and sulk together in Latin. You know, and what is worse, they have an idiot servant who they've hired, who is a sort of lummock of a lad who can't cook, and Manning tries hard to find something nice to say about him and says, well, he's very good at folding clothes. I can't fold anything bigger than a handkerchief. At least he's helping us to fold clothes. But then they arrive in Lhasa, and it's a total disaster because he's in the middle of this extraordinary religious culture which is totally unknown, totally unprepared for. He wants to know what's going on. Now, his Moonshi friend is a Catholic and says, it's idolatry. And paganism, and he says, yeah, but what's it about? And the guy says, who cares? You know. So he asks the servant, and it turns out the servant is a Muslim. He's a Hui, and he says, what's all this? And the servant says, it's idolatry, it's paganism, who cares? And the poor guy gets absolutely furious. Now, by this stage, the Chinese are aware that he's in Lhasa, and he's hoping, well, they know I'm in Lhasa, but at least if they throw me out, maybe I'll go home, you know, overland to Canton. At least that'll be interesting. But no, he's sent back the way he's come, and his poor Moonshi friend is sent off in chains, in exile. At least he's got enough money to bribe people that he doesn't have his head chopped off. This is, again, you know, a rather backward step for Chinese language education in Britain. In fact, it would seem that Manning, through, I think the Catholic Church had very good connections throughout China at this stage, and when people were sent into exile, they knew where they'd gone. Not immediately, of course, but they could find out. And Manning sent a rather large sum of money, and possibly, though I don't know this, I hope he sent a note saying sorry. But that was the end of that one. But extraordinarily enough, other people in Canton seem to have been happy, because that's where Manning went back to after his Tibetan trip, seemed to have been happy to continue to teach in Chinese. He eventually went on the Amherst mission to Peking, so in a sense he got to see China once, but then when he came back to Britain in 1817, he brought his Chinese teacher with him. We know this because of a man called Barry Cornwall, which is a pseudonym for a well-known writer, not Bernard Cornwall, Barry Cornwall, well-known writer of the time. And he says, I ran into, imagine this is kind of a Jane Austen scene, you know, Manning took his Chinese friend to a big ball in London, and the Chinese comes out and says, "Wow, that guy must have been rich to have all those people dancing for him." And Manning says, "No, it was all voluntary." And the Chinese says, "What? You mean?" Manning says, "They're doing it for fun." And the Chinese, "For fun?" More or less. So this is quite clear that this guy, at least for a while, was back in Britain. But he was not the first of these Munshi characters to be in Britain, because a guy called Sir John Davis, who's slightly later in date, became the first governor of Hong Kong, but was for a while employed in Canton by the East India Company, learnt a lot from people like Staunton and Morrison. He did the first kind of description of Chinese poetry, and in his survey of Chinese poetry, he includes a very long Chinese poem about London, which he says was written by an educated Chinese visitor in 1813. This can't be Manning's friend because it's too early, he's still out in the East. Who is it? The description says, it was the language teacher, I can't remember what term he uses, not Munshi, but he was the language teacher of a gentleman. Now, a gentleman might mean Sir George Staunton, who certainly went back to Britain for a while, around about 1813. And it's quite possible that his language teacher wrote this long poem about London. So we've got at least a couple of people who, in this category, who have been in London in the Regency period. It's possible there was one other, I'm not so sure about that. But this comes out of a story of the kind of John Keats of early 19th century Orientalism. There's a chap called John Fowler Hull, who alas died at the age of 25, but during his short life he looked like he was the coming thing in British studies of Asia, because it turned out he had a linguistic talent, and he came from a very comfortable Quaker background actually, but tragically all the immediate members of his family, his father, his sister, his older brother, all died while he was a teenager, and he ended up inheriting the family wealth and had nothing to do. So he devoted himself to language learning. Then he set off first to Europe and then headed east through Asia, learning languages and collecting manuscripts and so forth on the way. He got a bit south of Goa and died of a fever. But at least his books got sent back to Britain, and in fact the basis of the Chinese collection in the British Library is actually his books. And so he picked up some Chinese stuff, and he picked up about 30 languages he knew, before he died at the age of 25. He picked up some Chinese. Where? It says in Hartford College. Hartford College doesn't mean the Oxford College, it means the East India Company's language college in Hertfordshire, where they rounded up all the Munshis they could and started teaching Asian languages to the future employees of the company. But I don't think, he may have learned Chinese there from maybe Manning's friend, but I don't think he learnt Chinese from a Chinese person. I think he just studied the books, because I looked through the curriculum of this place, and occasionally you get people who are trained there for the China trade, but they do not teach them a word of Chinese. What they teach them is how to grade tea, which is really important, of course. What's it all come down to? Well, what it comes down to is that people like Staunton or Davis all say, look, we can't write anything about China, because without somebody to assist us, a Chinese scholar, we can't read this stuff. But on the other hand, the missionaries knew that to spread the gospel, they had to start teaching Chinese. And that's what Robert Morrison did when he was back in England briefly. And that's what started at UCL about a decade later. That without any Chinese assistance, missionaries who knew Chinese simply from being in the Chinese environment will start teaching Chinese, but it has to be pretty basic. And really, the Brits were lost without these people who we know nothing about their names or anything, but clearly they're vital, and I just thought, we have no image in China for these, but I think they ought to be remembered. Okay.